here and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to check the brake fluid level. And if you look at the reservoir carefully, you'll see it has a minimum and a maximum fill mark. And the normal level for brake fluid is somewhere between the two, because as the brakes wear, the caliper pistons move out and some of the fluid is displaced into the caliper. So if I were to top that off to the max, when I go ahead and do brakes and push that caliper piston back, it's going to overflow the master cylinder. So everything looks good with the brake fluid. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to check the power steering fluid level. And there's a little convenient dipstick attached to the cap. And again, there is a maximum and a minimum fill mark. So I wipe it clean, install it, pull it out and check it again. And it is right about where it should be, somewhere just above the minimum, leaving room for expansion. And part of the inspection requires checking the level of the windshield washer solvent, and that looks good. I'm going to go over here to the radiator, and I have what we call the overflow container, and there is again a level marked on that. There is a minimum and a maximum, and the level is between the two, leaving room for expansion. But because I live in Western New York and I know that we're entering an area in a time of freezing temperature, I need to check for proper freeze point. So to take the radiator cap off of a vehicle, it's a two-step process. You actually have to push down, turn, and then push down again. That's a safety feature, and you never do that when the engine is hot because there's pressure in there, and it can cause it to spew out and actually burn you, because the temperature of that coolant would be somewhere around 200 degrees. So I have a couple of tools for checking freeze point. One of them is a simple bulb tester, and what I want to do is stick it in the radiator, and I want to get that level up to that line. And then there is a little red triangle that swings up, and it correlates to a temperature. And if you notice, it's at the top of the scale, and that is actually minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's well over minus 43 degrees Celsius. So this radiator is thoroughly protected against freezing. The minimum recommended specification would be minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit for good coolant set to the proper freeze point. And I will just carefully return coolant, install the cap, and at this time I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to check the air filter. So always a good idea to check the air filter when you're doing a maintenance inspection, and this particular one's easy to get at. So what we want to look for is we want to make sure no rodents have got into the air box, and we can blow that out or vacuum it if you will. This one doesn't look too bad. And as far as the condition of the filter, what we want to do is we want to put a light behind there, and we want to make sure light passes through there. And I would probably at this point, because of the lack of visible light coming through the filter, I would recommend replacing it. And there is a service interval for the air filter that you can also find on ALLDATA. But a good filter will allow light to pass through. When they begin to get plugged with fine particles, it restricts the light travel through the filter. So this particular vehicle has a transmission fill tube, but it does not have a dipstick. So what I have is I have a universal tool for checking transmission fluid level. And one thing I have to be aware of is on the scale, it has different temperature readings that are going to tell me at a specific temperature what the appropriate level should be. And at normal operating temperature, the max fill should be right there at that hole. This particular vehicle is cold, so I would expect the level to correspond to a temperature and the transmission temperature of this fluid is probably somewhere around 100 degrees at this point. So I removed the sealing cap, and again, there's no dipstick. So I stick the universal dipstick down into the transmission to get a reading, and I want to be careful not to fold it over, just going down deep enough so it bottoms out. And then I am going to look at my level, and you can see that the transmission is actually low. There's a little bit of fluid on the stick, but that is not indicative of a full transmission. And I noticed when I was doing the oil change that there was some transmission fluid that had seeped out around the oil pan gasket for the transmission, which is somewhat normal at 70,000 miles. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to top this off and set it to the appropriate level. I've added a little transmission fluid. I actually added 1.5 quarts, and I am going to recheck it, and that whole time the engine was running, so the transmission fluid temperature was increasing. And I am at almost the 40 degrees Celsius mark, which would be about normal for the temperature of the fluid at this point. All right, so working off of our multi-point sheet and our basic maintenance, we have to check differential levels. And this particular differential just uses a rubber plug. I remove the plug and I make sure the gear oil level is right to the bottom edge of that hole, which it is. And then I'll put the plug back in. And while I'm back here, I am inspecting the coil springs, make sure I have no broken springs. I'm looking at all of my bushings. I'm looking at my shocks, and something worth noting here, you will look at this shock absorber. It is actually leaking its hydraulic fluid, and it's been leaking for a while. It should be dry like the other one, so I'm going to recommend that the customer replace that shock because it is part of New York State inspection, and because it is leaking, this vehicle would not pass the safety inspection. So moving forward, the next thing I'm going to do is check my transfer case fluid levels. And I have 2 plugs. One of them is a drain plug, one of them is a fluid level plug. And it'll be just like the rear differential, the level needs to be to the bottom of that hole. So this particular plug, I can use an Allen socket. I'm going to go ahead and remove it. And I am going to, again, make sure the level is right to the bottom of the hole, which it appears to be. And if I needed to top this off for any reason, I could look under the fluid specifications and all that, and that would tell me what to put in it. Something worth noting, these particular plugs are pipe thread, which means the plug itself is tapered. So when you install them, you only go until it is snug because it does not bottom out. So if you keep tightening it, you run the risk of damaging the case half itself, or you expand the hole to the point where it will no longer seal. So that's snug, and that's good enough for the transfer case. Because this vehicle is 4-wheel drive, there is a front differential and there is a plug that needs to come out. It's also one of those pipe plugs that we talked about when we looked at the transfer case. So I will remove that, and I'm going to verify that the required fluid is at the bottom of the hole and you can actually see it coming out, so that looks good. The level looks good. I'm going to replace the plug. And I'm just going to snug it up. And that should suffice.